So there were these guys, right?
Two brothers.
Who made this little country.
Hold on. What?
Called Rome. And there were something like 70 emperors. So it's safe to say that there were some good ones and some shit ones. So today we're going to take a look at who the best were, look at their weaknesses, and then determine who was the bestest of the best.
But I'm the best.
Numero uno was the one, the only Augustus. Augustus, woo.
Woo!
But for real, this dude was the real deal. His uncle Caesar was stabbed to death by his fellow senators for being an accused tyrant. P.S. He was a total tyrant. P.S.S. Caesar could have actually been considered an emperor. He was named dictator for life and held the powers of an emperor already, but due to his assassination, people tend to overlook that kind of info. Anyways, Augustus defeated the assassins, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra. He made the outline of the empire that would stand for 400 years. He had a ton of construction projects, he made the Praetorian Guard, and made an official police and firefighting office. Next up on the list is the God King Nero himself.
You're a bad man!
JK. He's gonna go on the list of the worst emperors. In actuality, next up is a cool dude named Trajan. He is the man that put the empire at its territorial height. He sacked the capital of the Parthian Empire. He also made a ton of infrastructure. A new forum, a long pointy stick, the longest bridge for 1,000 years, etc. He died after ruling for nearly 20 years. After this, every emperor will be inaugurated with the words, "May he be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan." Trajan kicked the bucket, and then his little cousin Hadrian stepped up to bat. It's safe to say that Hadrian was the most attentive leader Rome ever had. He saw that what Trajan did was untenable and decided, you know what, fuck it. Let's just give up on what he did and consolidate. And while you would imagine to the world-conquering Romans that this would be blasphemous, not really. Only a few disagreed, and it soon became clear that Hadrian was 100% correct. He toured the whole empire, being the first one to do this, and he looked to fix any problems he saw. On the whole, the guy understood what the idea of Rome really was. I'm going to talk about his successor in a minute, but I would like to talk about his successor's successor. You know him, you love him, seen a movie about him, you heard a few quotes and think you're enlightened. Marcus Aurelius. In all honesty, this guy was truly awesome. Sure, he fought wars like all the rest against the Parthians, Germans, Armenians, and others. The thing that makes him truly great is this little thing called stoicism. He would sleep on cold floors, out in the open, and decided to live life with as little filler as possible. Could you imagine if the most powerful man in the world, no, not him, not him either, there you go. Imagine if this god of a man strove to avoid splendor, chose to avoid materialism, chose to write memoirs that would survive and become a handbook for people aspiring to be like him. Well, we all know the Zuck isn't going to do that, but Marcus Aurelius did, and in my opinion, that by itself puts him in contention for the best emperor. Well, let's move 100 years into the future to see this little thing called the crisis of the 3rd century. It's essentially a game of musical chairs for the title of emperor. It was mostly peaceful. This caused suffering and mayhem on a scale that had never been seen before. There were over 26 claimants to the empire in a 50-year period. During this dumpster fire, there was one dude that rose to the occasion, the sun god Aurelian. This guy was basically a mix between Rommel, Spartacus, Napoleon, Hannibal, Alexander, etc. The empire was divided, barbarians were invading, it was as if the world was ending. He came in, he smashed the barbarians, brought the splinter empires to heel, and built walls. He was basically the next Julius Caesar. However, he worshipped a god that wasn't all that popular at the time called Sol Invictus. It's hard to explain, but it's like a combination of all the gods into one, who was the everlasting sun. Fun side note, a lot of Christianity's traditions originated from Sol Invictus, such as its festival date being December 25th. To immortalize Aurelian, he was granted the title Restorer of the World. P.S. Coolest title ever. However, it was still a little hectic, and he got stabbed in the back by his own guards. There were half a dozen successors to him over the next 10 years. However, they all conveniently died. So our boy Diocletian comes into play. His ascension can be seen as the end of the 3rd century crisis. He was a great reformer. He famously created the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four. Thanks to this, each emperor had a control over a fourth of the empire. This allowed for consolidation, growth, and it would ultimately allow the empire to live nearly another 2 centuries. He tried to stop hyperinflation. He doubled the empire's provinces, and arguably, most famously, he gave up the purple to go grow cabbages on his farm. One funny story that can give you an idea of his character was when people asked Diocletian to come back and become emperor. His answer was simple: "If you could see my cabbages I grew with my own hands, you would not ask such a thing of me." What a legend. A true Sigma male. I have 2 more emperors to go over, and one of them is really well known in the West as Constantine the Great. His dad was one of the original tetrarchs. Constantine would fight a few wars to defeat the other emperors and become the sole emperor. He looked to reform the government and started with the currency. He made a new coin called the solidus, which would become the basis of currency over 1,000 years later. He consolidated the empire and looked to avoid any barbarian invasions. In this regard, he was very successful. However, he is most famous for 2 things. He made Constantinople, which would be the Byzantine Empire's capital over 1,000 years later. He was also the first Christian emperor, and it can be said that the European world is primarily Christian due to his conversion. I've gone over a few contenders for the title. I think it's best to discuss why I think that they were not necessarily the best. Augustus being the first emperor and the longest reigning is often looked as the stereotypical great emperor. However, he was a bit tyrannical. His civil wars nearly destroyed Rome. Expeditions in Germania also had massive ramifications on the empire. Trajan, while probably the second best, definitely set the frameworks for cracks in the foundations of the empire. When he moved massive amounts of troops during the wars, it allowed for barbarians to move in, and this would become a repeating cycle that would eventually lead to the fall. Hadrian was the micromanager that Trump wished he could be. He was a great administrator, yet he was very cruel, authoritarian, and repressive. Marcus Aurelius should probably be the number 1 pick here, yet his successor ruined this. He didn't do as the previous emperors did in adopting heirs who were disciplined. His son Commodus, you may have heard of him, was an embarrassment and was the cause of the 3rd century crisis. Aurelian was very cruel, like very cruel. While he did restore the empire, he only ruled for 5 years, and other than his military conquest, he merely led the groundwork for what would be Diocletian. Speaking of Diocletian, he was willing to share power in the hopes of keeping the empire standing, yet this would not last long after his death. He also persecuted Christians in what would be seen as war crimes if he were alive today. There are not that many flaws in Constantine's case, yet he did murder his heir, who by all accounts was very competent and liked. His successors were neither. Now then, on to, in my opinion, the emperor who was luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Drum roll, please. Antoninus Pius.
Well, Dick, here's the deal. I'm the best there is, plain and simple. I mean, I wake up in the morning, I piss excellence, and nobody can hang with my stuff.
One has to consider what really makes an emperor great. Is it conquest, longevity, administration? I believe that it is the betterment of your people. There are no records in the entire history of his reign of any military conquest or major campaigns. While there have not been that many invasions or internal conflicts in this period as in the 3rd century crisis, they still occurred up until this point. He had none of this. He didn't even leave Italy in his 23-year reign. Imagine that. He left billions in the treasury for his successors. This allowed a plague that occurred a few years after his death to become manageable, when in actuality it should have been the end of Rome. He had children of his own, but saw the potential in Marcus Aurelius, and he named him his heir. He was a proponent of the suffrage of slaves. He suspended tax collection in cities that were affected by disasters. He respected the Senate and was known as an honorable man. All in all, I believe that he was the man who best represented what the people wanted and who upheld the principle of a Roman. Let me know what you think in the comments. I know Smith's really going to be gaslighting me for this one, but he's the real deal. I don't know if y'all saw that fucking Finland one I did, but it was spectacular. So is this one. So if you have any questions or anything, direct them to Smith. I'll put his links in the description, and I will see y'all later. Thank you.